April the 2nd, 1941. Stuttgart, Germany. Rain slicked the cobblestones outside the Daimler-Benz proving grounds as a group of Wehrmacht officers gathered under gray umbrellas. Parked before them was an odd-looking contraption, small, squat, and almost toy-like compared to the hulking staff cars and armored trucks they were used to. A visiting American officer, part of an early pre-war automotive delegation, stood proudly beside it. "This," he said, patting the hood, "is the U.S. Army's new all-purpose field vehicle, lightweight, four-wheel drive. Built for anything." The German officers exchanged smirks. One, Oberst Heinrich Vollmer, leaned to his colleague and muttered in German, "A child's wagon. They expect to fight a war in that?" The others chuckled. They had their own machines to boast about. The Kübelwagen, an efficient, air-cooled marvel based on the Volkswagen Beetle, and the mighty Stickerkäfes, staff cars, symbols of German engineering precision. Compared to them, the Jeep, as the Americans casually called it, looked crude and underbuilt, a farm tractor pretending to be a military vehicle. But what Vollmer didn't know, what few in Germany understood, yet was that this little boxy machine would soon become one of the most feared and respected sights on the battlefields of Europe, thousands of miles away. Across the Atlantic, America was still gearing up for war. The Army had put out an urgent request, a lightweight reconnaissance car capable of handling mud, snow, sand, and rocks, a vehicle that could be mass-produced fast and maintained by any soldier with a wrench. Only two companies rose to the challenge, Willys Overland and the Bantam Car Company. Against all odds, they were given just 49 days to deliver a working prototype. Engineers worked around the clock, welding steel in the glow of workshop lamps, the smell of oil and solder thick in the air. The result, where the Willys quad, it was ugly, boxy, and bare-boned. But it could do something no other car could. Climb a 60% grade, cross streams, turn on a dime, and never quit. By the time the first prototypes rolled onto muddy testing grounds, officers watched in disbelief as the tiny vehicle clawed through swamps and over boulders where their heavier trucks stalled. It wasn't pretty, but it was unstoppable. In late 1941, as America entered the war, the vehicle's production exploded, renamed the Willys MB, and later the Jeep. It rolled off factory lines at a staggering pace. Soldiers would soon describe it as their best friend in war, capable of doing the work of 10 men. Back in Europe, the same German generals who had once laughed would soon face the sight of entire columns of jeeps roaring through mud and snow, carrying soldiers, medics, generals, and machine guns. What began as a joke was about to become the symbol of Allied mobility, the vehicle that crossed continents, won campaigns, and, in the words of one officer, did everything except fly. But first, it had to prove itself in the crucible of war. December 9th, 1942, Tunisia. The desert wind howled across the North African dunes, blowing fine sand that ground into gears, rifles, and human skin. In the midst of it all, a convoy of jeeps bounced over ridges and gullies, their engines whining under the brutal sun. Private First Class James Red Holloway gripped the steering wheel tight as his jeep bucked over a rock. His sergeant rode shotgun, map fluttering in his hand. "If this thing breaks down," the sergeant yelled over the roar of the engine, "we're done for." But the jeep didn't break down. All around them, heavier vehicles, British trucks and even German half-tracks, were bogged down in the soft sand. The jeep kept going, cutting its own path, dragging supply trailers, wounded men, and even anti-tank guns through terrain thought impassable. When General Eisenhower later arrived in North Africa to oversee Allied operations, he famously declared, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." And it wasn't an exaggeration. The Jeep became the Swiss Army knife of vehicles. It carried ammo, food, troops, medics, and messages. It was converted into ambulances, reconnaissance scouts, and even mobile machine gun nests. Mechanics fitted them with stretchers, radios, and water tanks. Some soldiers joked that the only thing the Jeep couldn't do was make coffee, though some inventive GIs found a way to use the engine heat for that. 2. In one daring mission during the Tunisia campaign, a Jeep squadron of the Long-Range Desert Group drove hundreds of miles behind enemy lines. Their mission, to raid German supply convoys. With extra fuel cans strapped to the sides and .50 caliber machine guns bolted to the rear, they tore through Axis lines like ghosts, firing, disappearing, and reappearing miles away. The Germans began to take notice. Reports flooded in describing fast American scout cars that appeared from nowhere, delivered chaos, and vanished into the sand. German engineers who had once sneered at the toy car were forced to study captured jeeps, only to discover they had nothing like it in their arsenal. Meanwhile, across Europe, the jeep's legend grew. In Sicily, it climbed volcanic rock. In Italy, it hauled wounded men down muddy mountain trails. And in France, it ferried generals and infantry alike across shattered roads and rivers. By 1944, when the Allies prepared for the D-Day landings, Over 500,000 Jeeps had been produced. Crated and shipped across the Atlantic, they rolled off landing craft and straight into the mud of Normandy. German soldiers watched in disbelief as the Allies advanced not with ponderous convoys, but with waves of these nimble, tireless machines. Everywhere the Wehrmacht turned, the Jeep was there, hauling, towing, rescuing, and fighting. The toy car had become a war horse. June 9th, 1944. Normandy. France-stought rain hammered down on the hedgerows of Normandy. The roads were little more than rivers of mud, choked with debris from burned-out trucks and shattered tanks. But in that chaos, a line of Jeeps pressed forward, headlights dimmed, engines roaring. Lieutenant William Bill Cartwright crouched low behind the windshield of his Jeep, his uniform soaked through. His men were pinned down in a small French village ahead, and every minute mattered. "Let's move," he shouted, and the Jeep lurched forward, bouncing over shell holes. German machine gun fire ripped through the mist, but the Jeep darted across the open ground like a hunted animal. Fast, low, unpredictable. By the time it screeched to a halt behind a stone wall, the men it carried were already jumping off with supplies, ammo, and stretchers. That was how the Jeep worked. Never waiting, never stopping. It was movement embodied. The Germans began calling it das springende Auto, the jumping car, because of the way it bounded over terrain their own Kübelwagens couldn't handle. To the Wehrmacht's frustration, every time they destroyed a bridge, cratered a road, or flooded a field to slow the Allied advance, the Jeeps somehow found a way through. When Sherman tanks bogged down in the mud, Jeeps went around them, carrying vital messages or ferrying troops under cover of darkness. There's a story, told and retold by veterans, of one Jeep that traveled from Normandy all the way to Berlin without a single breakdown. The driver claimed he changed the oil twice and replaced one tire. That was it. It wasn't luck. It was design. The Jeep's 60-horsepower engine was simple, light, and air-cooled. It could be repaired with a wrench and a hammer. Its flat grille and high clearance meant it could plow through mud and brush, and its lightweight frame could even be lifted by a few soldiers if it got stuck. Engineers once demonstrated its durability by pushing one off a 5-foot cliff. It landed, bounced, and drove off. That wasn't an exaggeration. It was standard testing. When Patton's Third Army thundered across France, Jeeps led the way, guiding convoys and towing artillery. When the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne needed supplies during the siege of Bastogne, Jeeps carried them in under fire. Even General George S. Patton himself rode into towns, standing upright in the passenger seat of a Jeep. Ivory-handled pistols glinting, barking orders at his men. The German high command was stunned. They had built some of the most advanced tanks and vehicles in the world, but they couldn't match the Allies' mobility. Where German divisions needed trucks, repair crews, and fuel convoys, the Americans needed little more than a Jeep and a can of gas. And the deeper the Allies pushed into Europe, the more that little machine became a symbol, not just of movement, but of unstoppable determination. The Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was a statement. Nothing could stop the Allies from moving forward. March 25th, 1945. Near the Rhine River, Germany. The cold mist of early spring hung over the water as hundreds of American soldiers waited for the order to cross. Artillery thundered in the distance. The last natural barrier between the Allies and the heart of Germany loomed ahead. Captain Thomas Beck leaned against the hood of his Jeep, cigarette in hand, watching engineers construct pontoon bridges under enemy fire. His Jeep was battered, mud-caked, the windshield cracked. Yet it had carried him from the beaches of Normandy to the edge of the Rhine without once failing to start. When the order finally came, the first vehicle to roll onto the new bridge wasn't a tank. It was a Jeep. As it bounced across the pontoons, the soldiers on the riverbanks cheered. Behind it, a line of them followed. Jeeps carrying officers, medics, and ammunition. The little machine that had once been mocked as a toy now led the crossing into Germany itself. On the other side of the river, German soldiers watched through binoculars. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Hours earlier, Allied artillery had reduced the area to rubble. Yet somehow, these Americans were already driving across new bridges, their Jeeps zipping through smoke and debris as if the war itself couldn't touch them. One German officer, captured later, reportedly said, "We destroyed roads, bridges, and tanks, but never the will of the men in those little cars." From there, the Jeep became the face of liberation. It rumbled through bombed-out villages, cheered by civilians waving tattered flags. It carried medics to the wounded and refugees to safety. It climbed over rubble in cities that had no roads left, ferrying generals and grunts alike toward victory. When American troops reached concentration camps like Buchenwald and Dachau, Jeeps were among the first vehicles through the gates, carrying doctors, chaplains, and photographers who would reveal the horrors to the world. By war's end, over 650,000 Jeeps had been built. They had crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers, and Europe itself. In May 1945, as Berlin fell and peace crept over the continent, Jeeps parked in the ruins of the Reichstag, American flags fluttering from their antennas. Soldiers leaned on their hoods, exhausted but triumphant, knowing those machines had carried them every mile of the way. When the war was finally over, the Jeep didn't disappear. It became a legend. Farmers used it to plow fields. Explorers took it to the Himalayas. Presidents rode in it during parades. What began as a laughable prototype, a 2,200-pound, four-wheel drive toy, had crossed continents, outlasted empires, and reshaped modern warfare. It wasn't just a machine. It was a testament to what happens when simplicity meets necessity, and when innovation is forged in the fire of war. Even decades later, veterans would look at the familiar grill and whisper, "Oh, that little thing carried us through hell and back." And the truth was undeniable. The Jeep didn't just move armies, it moved history.